Hello and welcome to the Week 3 Meta Report. This time we're going to be looking at Solo Self-Found and Hardcore, both of which have very different build environments. But even if you don't play Solo Self-Found or Hardcore, there is something you can learn from it. For example, if you don't like dying to wisp-juiced monsters, you can learn how Hardcore players are layering their defenses to avoid that grim fate. And even if you don't play Solo Self-Found, if you're looking for a budget build that doesn't require a lot of specialized unique items or a ton of trading, well, that's essentially what Solo Self-Found is. So you might find the build that's perfect for you. There are also differences in terms of the types of builds people play. For example, in Softcore Trade, it's common to have dedicated bossers. In Solo Self-Found, that isn't really a thing. You can't just buy boss sets. And even if you could just buy boss sets, that doesn't give you most of the stuff that you want. It gives you specific items. So if you're farming for a drop from Exarch, you'll farm Exarch as much as you can. But you're not going to go do Uber Shaper just because it happens to be the most profitable Uber boss at the current time. Thus, builds in SSF tend to be more of all-rounders as opposed to something dedicated. Whereas in Hardcore, people also don't tend to make bossers because bossing is very dangerous, and if you lose your character, then you're going to restart. But we definitely have seen some interesting parallels here with the builds people are taking into void maps, and at least some of the builds that people are using to boss in Hardcore, because if it can survive a tier 17 void map in Softcore, it's probably fine for a pinnacle boss in HC. So here we have the Week 3 snapshot for Affliction League. The most popular builds are Tornado Shot, SRS, Penance Brand of Dissipation, Detonate Dead, Lightning Arrow, Bone Shatter, Cyclone, Hex Blast, Caustic Arrow of Poison, Frenzy, Splitting Steel Fall, Detonate Dead. I suspect this is mostly just a utility link though, as opposed to an actual Frenzy build. Yep, this is just a utility link where it's being used to trigger additional effects. Here we go. Frenzy on Mana Forged Arrow with Cast on Crit, Power Charge on Crit, Life Tap, Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice. Like I said, not really a build per se, just fun utility. Now, if I was to call out a build on this list as being particularly Softcore Trade, it would have to be the Tornado Shot. After all, most of those builds are glass cannons, making them ineffective in Hardcore, and they require a lot of expensive items, making them far less effective in Solo Self-Found. But let's swap things up and see how it goes. So in SSF, we've got SRS Guardian, Penance Brand of Dissipation. This kind of surprises me. At 10%, it's a little more overrepresented than I expected. While the build is strong, can be played with decently easy to acquire items, and almost a well-rounder, it's a little less good at mapping than I would have expected for this level of play rate. I mean, 10% is quite a lot. Then we have Bone Shatter, Tornado Shot, which is getting up there as people get more gear. We wouldn't have seen that in week 1. Lightning Arrow, Caustic Arrow of Poison, Detonate Dead, Artillery Ballista, which is the support, Scourge Arrow of Menace, Explosive Arrow, Splitting Steel. As you can see, all-rounders are more represented, and Glass Cannon or specialized builds like Magic Find are less represented. You can even see this reflected here. Far less of the meta is using any sort of Magic Find gear, though Divination Distillate is still 2%, so it's not like nobody's doing it. And Loop of All is much more popular because this ring solves a lot of problems. It gives damage, rarity, which is nice, resistances, and attributes. Pretty much everything you need, making it a great choice in SSF. In Trade League, it gets crept out a little bit. And again, people are definitely playing Magic Find, with Ventor's Gamble and Goldworm still being the most popular items, despite being far less represented than in Softcore Trade, with 17 and 15% respectively. Now, looking at Hardcore, we see a little bit of a different picture. SRS is still dominant, Bone Shatter's gone up, Penance Brand of Dissipation's still there, but things like Detonate Dead are much more dominant, and even Righteous Fire is making an appearance. I guess that build wasn't quite so dead after all. In fact, we're seeing a lot of Righteous Fire Chieftains, which is notorious for performing well in a low gear environment while also being tanky. Chieftain and Jug, that is. Inquisitor, which is also very popular, a little bit less so, but you can build it tanky, and that's exactly what people are doing. Remember, there aren't going to be many dedicated bossers here, which is why, just like with SSF, we saw less Hexblast characters, and now the Magic Find is almost completely gone, down to 4%, which is actually still higher than the average league, but certainly a lot lower than, well, Softcore Trade and even Solo Self-Found. The reason for this is magic find gear does not increase your defenses at all. It doesn't keep you alive. And if it's not keeping you alive, then you have a problem. Because even in a low tier map like a tier 7, some of those Wisp-empowered monsters are genuinely terrifying. So now that we have hopefully a slightly better picture of the sort of builds in solo, self-found, and hardcore, where it tends to be more of all-rounders. There's a bigger focus on builds that can scale defenses easily, like SRS, which is played on Guardian, Penance Brand that does pretty much infinite damage, Poison builds that again have a lot of damage from tinctures so they can focus more on defenses, and Detonate Dead, Bone Shatter, the things you'd expect, the builds that are almost known for being in hardcore at this point. Well, let's take a look at a couple of examples that I found to be particularly interesting, one from solo self-found and one from hardcore. First up, the explosive trap of Shrapnel solo self-found Trickster. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First, it's using a cool transfigured gem, Explosive Trap of Shrapnel, one that focuses on creating a lot of explosions with a much larger radius than normal explosive trap. This solves one of the problems that regular explosive trap runs into, where you do a lot of damage in a relatively limited area. Something else cool about this is we're not a saboteur. We're a trickster, so we've got some really good defenses, the ability to scale frenzy charges for really smooth play through charged traps, and of course, easy access to spell suppression even before taking the charms into effect. Never mind the fact that you get crit multi per power charge, which is just completely insane. These aren't perfect rolls, it goes up to 5%, but for SSF, that makes total sense. After all, in my playtime, I've only found 5%, so it makes perfect sense that he hasn't found any yet. Or at least none that also have spell suppression on it, or cannot take reflected elemental damage. We've also got a Viridi's Veil. This helmet used to be a lot more popular, but it's still pretty darn solid. You can use it to enhance your auras, and if you wear a magic ring, you either you are hexproof, effectively curse immunity, or you take no extra damage from crits. The ring is in the right slot, so we're going for hexproof. We've got the classic, minus mana cost and a ton of chaos res. There's a shield, nice for defenses, doesn't do too much for damage, but you probably don't need damage on this build. A really cool talisman. I very much like the Fizz as extra of a random element. Kind of goes with a Rainbow Trapper theme. I'm sure a Heat Shiver is what people would play in softcore, but I like that hardcore is forcing the, let's just say, extra creativity. You can't just slap on a Mage Blood and say, oh look, I'm curse immune now. So instead of going for extra damage, because this probably does plenty, we're going for extra defenses. And you also see a weapon that would probably not show up in softcore. Gain 1 mana per enemy killed. It's not perfect by any means, but it's also really good because of a non-chaos extra, which is especially important for a skill like Explosive Trap that starts as Fizz and gets converted. You effectively double dip there, getting 5% of Fizz's extra, then 5% of the cold or fire you're converting to. I also quite like the That Which Was Taken for a 5% chance to throw 4 additional traps. It's a good way to get that extra throw speed without having to use multiple trap support, which is a pretty significant tax to your damage in a lot of ways. Sure, you get more traps thrown, but if those traps aren't overlapping, each trap does less damage, thus making the clear a little bit awkward. I also personally quite like the Enduring Cry tech. Enduring Cry is pretty underrated. Even if you're not using it for endurance charges, it's a great Life Flask replacement or Life Flask augment. And we've got a Taste of Hate, because if you're going to be doing Fizz and Cold anyway, you might as well throw it in. Plus, it's reasonably easy to obtain due to a divination card existing for target farming. Also, I'd just like to point out that this is SSF with a crit chance while affected by hatred, cold damage while affected by hatred, Watcher's Eye. I don't know how much this is worth on trade, but I'm kind of curious and going to find out. What I do know is it's very nice and very valuable. Sometimes you do just get that lucky. So here we have the double hatred mod. Gonna hit enter. Yeah, 100 Divine Watcher's Eye in SSF. That's definitely something pretty badass. But now let's take a look at a hardcore build. Something that's made to never die, or at the very least only lives once. Normally when you see a hardcore build, you associate that with low DPS. but QWERTY here would like to disagree. This is a Fire Trap and Frost Blink Ignite setup, similar to something that Subtractem has played in the past. But it's a much more hardcore-focused version, and it takes advantage of the fact that you can use charms to get easy spell suppression, something that Elementalists previously struggled on. We're of course using Lightning Coil and Taste of Hate, a very common defensive setup to allow you to apply a lot of the fizz damage you take to your elemental resistances, which is especially nice for Bastion of Elements, and in any Ignite proliferation setup, well, you definitely want Heart of Destruction. Your Ignite Prolif doesn't hit things, so you get the 60% AoE, and it is generic, making for a huge amount of Ignite radius. I've played a build like this before, and the Ignite just blasts across the screen, especially when you're using Ignite proliferation support on something like Frostblink, where you're extremely mobile. Normally in Hardcore, you wouldn't necessarily want to teleport into a pack of enemies. After all, that's when they get to hit you. With Frostblink, you can kind of teleport through them, going from the front point, where you'll splash the front of a pack, to the back point, where you'll splash the back, and then the Prolif ripples through from both sides, killing everything almost instantly. Or if you're tanky enough and confident enough, you go right in the center. Just remember, you do only live once. On the Fire Trap itself, this is all about single target damage. We don't care about AoE or Prolif or anything. This is just to do a massive hit. And at 7.2 mil dot, not even counting all of the buffs that PoB doesn't necessarily track on PoE Ninja, this is looking pretty darn good. I remember a time when any build in HC would have like 50,000 armor at 7k life. This really shows how much defenses have changed and how far they've come, that at 5.8k life and 2k armor, I can look at this and go, yeah, they're probably nearly immortal. I don't think they have a 100 Divine Watcher's Eye, but I'm also not super familiar with the hardcore economy, so they very well could. I like the choice of Elementalist. It puts you in the perfect part of a tree to take, well, pretty much all these nodes. Easy access to Ignite and dot stuff like Elemental Overload, where you do hit enough to trigger that reliably. Dex is a problem. That's why we're seeing the Lethal Pride being used to fix that, as you definitely need quite a bit for your Fire Trap and a couple other items here. And it even lets you go down here for block if you so desire. Remember, Hardcore has a smaller economy than Softcore, meaning in some ways the gear's limited like SSF. Definitely not to the same extent, but more so than you'd see in Softcore Trade. So while a lot of Softcore Trade builds go for speed and then fix their problems later, Hardcore builds go for surviving at all costs and only get this damage when the build is really strong. One of the coolest pieces of gear here is definitely the gloves. +2 AoE, socketed gems do 30% more dot. It's a pseudo 6-link effect that's going to be very, very good at scaling the Frostblink DPS. With this, you'll have no issues at all. Your Ignites will come in and absolutely destroy the competition. And hey, if something manages to survive, just toss a Fire Trap on it. You're effectively getting both the Burning Ground and the Ignite. Now, as an example of what I mean by things you only see in Hardcore, an extra focus on defenses, Malevolent is being run on the Blessing, and instead, the permanent aura is Flesh and Stone. When's the last time you've seen Flesh and Stone used for its defensive benefits on a softcore build? Probably before they nerfed it, which was a long time ago. But you still see it in Hardcore, because again, if you need to survive at all costs, 16% less damage from attacks is still 16% less damage from attacks. And so those are my thoughts on some of the differences between the Softcore Trade, Hardcore Trade, and solo self-found metas for Affliction League. A lot of the builds between the three are very similar, and you could probably see that from the things people are playing at the top end, the most popular. But if you dig deep enough, look at the skills that have a 1% play rate or a 0.5% play rate, and all of a sudden you'll find things played by a significant number of people that don't show up when you only look at the top of a list, which is why I wanted to highlight two builds that are both a little bit different and quite interesting. This is a great league for experimentation, as currency is relatively easy to make. But I'm curious, have you played solo self-found or hardcore? And if so, what builds did you find success with? Let me know down in the comments below. Personally, I don't really like either game mode. I like my trade, I like being able to trade for a bunch of stuff and craft, and so that's what I'm going to keep doing. Now, if you want to watch something else, then maybe check out last week's meta report where we highlighted some breakout builds, including Penance Brand of Dissipation, or the week before where we looked over the top winners and losers of the league start patch. Or you can always read more at Maxwell GG. A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. If you want to see more meta reports come out and have $1 a month, then you can support using the link below. But that's all for me today. I know this one was a little bit shorter than normal, and I do like to show at least a couple builds from each section most of the time, but with the Torchlight Infinite season start, I didn't have as much time to research as I normally do. So I wanted to pick 2 things that really stood out to me, as opposed to a few that were maybe a little bit more questionable. And so thanks for watching to the end, hope you learned something, and I'll see you again next week for the last episode of the Affliction League Meta Report.